Hello, it's 3 a.m. on September 15th. After recording the previous video, which I ended by saying I'm going to compute a p-value for these tarot readings, I decided time to categorize my cards and decide how I feel about each of them in advance. And so I split the cards into 4 categories: things that I would interpret as giving a no, things that I would interpret as giving a yes, things that are giving an ambiguous answer, and things that just seem like they're punting on the question or not particularly relevant. The kind of thing that makes you feel like the readings are coming out random. And I was actually quite surprised that the categories that had the most cards were the ambiguous category and the dud categories. These are my categories. Um, this stack on that direction. I don't know if the camera is going to be flipped, but uh, let me try to place the camera place where you could see the spread. Okay, right. So this category here is kind of my dud category, where I feel like if spirit guides were spitting this out, I'd be like, you are not doing your job very well. Then this category is where I'm like, okay, maybe you're trying to send me a message, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. I mean, it's like these cards feel more like advice, and I can see why they're relevant. And some of these cards I actually see a lot in readings. For example, this Epiphany card: joy through spiritual growth, be a light to others, answers that come through meditation. I see it a lot in my readings, but if I saw that in the final outcome spot for a question about Emily, I'd be like, you're punting on the question. This is not what I asked about. Um, but of the cards in this category, since some of them I do have a connection to, but I just put them in this category because they don't feel very relevant for questions about Emily. It was both Epiphany and Solutions. These cards I've seen. Both these cards I've seen several times in readings. This is what the Epiphany card looks like. Okay. Moving on. These cards, I'm like, well, if I were to see these in the final outcome spot, I'd take that as a no. For example, this Queen of Michael card literally says a time for your career rather than relationships. I'd be like, that's the fates being like, stop focusing on this. And something like the Five of Raphael card, it's I think of this as the breakup card. It's like very much everything happens for a reason type of card. So there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 cards in this category that I placed. Now these cards, I do acknowledge that this deck is written to have a bit of feels like a positivity bias. So in the yes category, it felt like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 cards. So slightly more than the 11 that I put in the no category. But I also separated out the yes piles into, these are the yeses that I don't have any strong prior connection to. I guess the High Priestess is one exception. This card has come up in several of my readings, often in the context of something that like represents, like if I'm doing the reading for someone, once this card came in the spot for the influence of others in the situation, and it says, the card says powerful psychic insights, reflection, and meditation that provides valuable information. It just feels like a card that I have a strong connection to, and the imagery looks a bit cool to me. So in that sense, I guess I have a prior connection, but it doesn't particularly speak to any outcome. If you read the text for this card, it's like emphasizing the power of psychic information. So I guess if I were to see that in the final outcome spot, it would, if you read the text, it says, take the psychic information you receive seriously. So based on the previous psychic reading I had, that would be interpreted as a yes. But the cards that I do have a prior connection to, and which I do interpret as yes, that's the ones in this stack. So there's several major arcana cards over here. A lot of the green cards are the deck of Raphael, representing emotion. And there's a couple of cards from the Ariel deck, Ariel representing the physical/material world, and the reason Queen of Ariel is in here is description of the Queen of Ariel reminds me a little bit about my perception of Emily, but I was actually not sure about that because actually I don't. She concealed a lot of details about herself, except for occasional things that would slip through. So I feel like I don't necessarily know her, but if I admit that the description of the Queen of Ariel reminds me of her, then I acknowledge I should, or my idealization of her, I guess. Then I put it there. But I guess since the colors of the decks have come up, purple cards are cards from the major arcana. They represent stages in a spiritual journey. Generally, a lot of purple cards mean a bunch of spiritual energy is supposed to be guiding the situation. Well, that's one way to interpret it. Um, Orange is the deck of Gabriel. It represents the spirit of creativity, change, that fire. In the elemental tarot deck, orange would the deck of Gabriel would correspond to fire. Um, Green is the deck of Raphael. That's emotion. In the elemental tarot, that would be water. Um, Blue is Michael, logic. So a lot of the no cards come from the Michael deck. All of these are in the no pile, and a lot of the ambiguous cards are from the Michael deck as well. Like all of these. And pink is the deck of Ariel. It's generally the material world. So a lot of the cards that I'm like, this feels like not relevant for the question. They're from the material world. Like if I asked a question about love and I get an answer about career, that's the kind of thing that makes you feel like the reading is random. But what I found is, a lot of times the reading doesn't feel random, and I was surprised to see that more cards than I expect are in the ambiguous and irrelevant categories. The fact that I haven't noticed these irrelevant cards coming up in a whole lot of readings means, I'm just surprised at the balance, given that I haven't noticed a lot of irrelevant cards coming up in my readings. But anyway, it takes energy for me to do a reading because I spent a lot of time feeling out the card. I mean, I don't see what's on the cards. I see the back, but you'll see how I do it. So I don't have the energy to do one now. But this is my attempt at some kind of pre-registration. And again, I was thinking of how I would interpret these cards if I saw them in some kind of outcome spot. So either near future or the final outcome spot in a 10-card tarot spread. They're spots that mean different things. But to a lesser extent, this interpretation could be applied to seeing the cards in other spots. But that wasn't what I was doing this categorization for. And of course, if I were to do a categorization for like questions about career, this would look totally different. But yeah, so that's that. And we'll see how the p-value stuff goes. I also do, in addition to tracking if there's an enrichment of yes cards, I think I will also want to track whether certain cards seem to be reoccurring more than chance, particularly now that I pointed out a few that I have a special connection to. I've also been uploading random stuff to my Flickr. Well, not random stuff, actually. Every time I've done a reading, I've uploaded it to Flickr, being like, well, at some point, if this lends itself to a p-value calculation, at least the data will be there. Cool. Yeah. Looking forward to those p-values. I'm thinking, how would you track whether some cards are enriched more than chance? Maybe you could look at the, I'm sure a chi-square test applies, but I think you need a lot of samples. Maybe you look at the entropy of the distribution, and again, I think you need a lot of samples to notice if there was something off about the entropy, like if it was lower than it should be. But I'm sure we'll think of something. Ideally, I'd have the study design laid out, but if anybody who's done science knows that it's hard to anticipate all the things you might want to take into account in advance. But this is a start. Okay. We'll see how it goes. And even if I do end up gathering the data, then figuring out the hypothesis, I'll do my best to make sure it's a reasonable one. That's the only promise you can make to yourself, after all.